What if the most dangerous man in Iran wasn't a general, wasn't a cleric, and never once held a weapon? What if the man keeping the entire Islamic Republic from collapsing was someone most people in the West couldn't even name? A quiet, methodical figure who had spent 5 decades making himself indispensable to every government Iran ever had. And what if Israel knew exactly who he was and had been watching him for years before anyone else understood why he mattered? On the night of March 16, 2026, an Israeli Air Force strike hit a private residential address in the Pardes suburb of eastern Tehran. The building was not a military installation. It carried no official markings. There were no guards visible from the street. It looked, from every angle, like a private home. It was a private home. And inside it, eating dinner with his daughter, was the man who had become, in the 17 days since Iran's supreme leader was killed, the last functioning center of power inside the Islamic Republic of Iran. His name was Ali Larijani, and Israel had been waiting for exactly this moment for a very long time. The woman who understood that better than almost anyone in Israeli intelligence was not a general, not a field operative, and not a name you will find in any press release. She was an analyst, senior Iran desk, Mossad's targeting division. We will call her Yael, not her real name, but her role was real. Yael had been working the Larijani file since 2021, not as an active assassination target. At that point, he wasn't. He was a political figure, powerful, yes, but operating within the normal architecture of Iranian governance in a way that placed him below the threshold for targeting. What Yael was doing in those early years was something more methodical. She was building a behavioral map, not of his politics, of his humanity. Where did he go when official channels closed? Who did he trust when trust became a liability? What habits did he maintain that no protocol would ever fully override? She had found one. It was in the file. It had been noted and set aside, because in 2021 it didn't matter yet. By March 2026, it was the most important thing in the building. To understand why Larijani became the primary target, you have to understand what happened to the Islamic Republic in the first hours of Operation Epic Fury. The American and Israeli joint campaign began on February 28, 2026. The first wave of strikes was not aimed at nuclear facilities or military bases. It was aimed at the command layer. The theory was straightforward: degrade leadership before degrading capability. Force the regime into reactive decision-making by removing the people who make decisions. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was killed on the first day. That single outcome changed the entire operational picture. Because what Israel and the United States had modeled in their pre-war intelligence assessments was a scenario where Khamenei's death would produce a paralyzed, leaderless regime, a headless body that would be unable to coordinate a coherent response. What they had not fully modeled was Ali Larijani. Within hours of Khamenei's death, before the smoke had cleared, Larijani was already moving. Not publicly, not toward a podium or a press conference. He was moving through back channels, reaching out to IRGC commanders, aligning with clerical figures, threading together the fractured pieces of the security establishment. He was not appointing himself supreme leader. He was doing something more dangerous. He was becoming the connective tissue of a regime that was supposed to be falling apart. Inside the Kiryat, Israel's defense headquarters in Tel Aviv, this was recognized almost immediately. The targeting priority was updated. Larijani was not just a political figure to be watched. He was an active, stabilizing force inside a regime that Israel and the United States needed to remain destabilized. As long as he was functioning, the strategic objective of the operation was incomplete. Find him. That was the order. The problem was, he was already gone. Within 6 hours of Khamenei's assassination, Larijani's communication devices went dark. Every known number, every device associated with his office, silent. His official vehicles stopped moving. His known residences went cold. The man had a protocol. He had prepared for exactly this scenario. And that preparation, the fact that it existed at all, that it was this clean, this fast, told Israeli intelligence analysts something deeply important. Larijani had known at some level that this moment was coming. Not the specific date, not the specific operation, but the category of event. He had built a personal disappearance protocol, and he had built it well. In the first 10 days of the war, the surveillance net tracking Larijani's known associates identified 37 vehicle movements that could potentially be connected to him or his security detail. 34 were confirmed as decoys, 2 were ambiguous. 1, a dark green Toyota moving through southern Tehran on the 4th of March, produced a 30-minute window where the targeting cell prepared a strike order. The order was paused. The intelligence was not clean. The strike, if executed on incomplete information, carried significant risks, civilian casualties in a densely populated district, and something arguably more costly. If the strike missed Larijani, he would know his movement patterns had been partially read. He would adapt, and a Larijani who knew he was being actively tracked would become exponentially harder to find. The order was stood down. That single decision, to wait for certainty rather than act on probability, would extend the hunt by 12 days. Not everyone in the targeting cell agreed with it, but the pauses are, in this kind of operation, where the real decisions live. Not in the strikes, but in the moments when the strike does not happen. Back in the analysis division, Yael was sitting with a problem that had no clean solution. The standard approach to finding a disappeared target was to increase surveillance pressure on his network, cover his known associates, monitor their communications, watch their physical movements, pressure the perimeter until someone makes contact with the center. Her supervisors were applying that approach. More coverage on his former colleagues, more coverage on his security officials, more coverage on his children. Yael believed this was wrong. Not tactically wrong in a way she could fully prove. Intuitively wrong in the way that comes from spending years inside a person's behavioral file. She had written in 2021 that Larijani's one unbreakable pattern was his relationship with his children. Not phone calls, not intermediaries. Physical contact, on his terms, at intervals he controlled. It was not a vulnerability in the operational sense, it was a human constant. The kind of behavior that exists below the level of protocol because it is not a decision. It is a reflex. And her argument in March 2026 was that increasing surveillance pressure on his daughter's residence in eastern Tehran would not draw Larijani in. It would push him away, his security detail would detect the increased coverage, and that detection would become a warning. He would never go near her. She recommended pulling back, creating a false quiet around the daughter's home, removing the pressure so that the human pull toward his family, could do what surveillance could not. Her supervisors rejected the recommendation. The war window was not unlimited. Political pressure to pause or constrain the operation was already building. They could not afford patience. They increased coverage on the daughter's residence. Yael made a note in the operational file. She returned to her screen. She did not argue further. She did not know yet whether she was right. She did not know yet what was about to happen on Quds Day, 6 days later. She did not know that Larijani was about to make a decision that would render the entire debate irrelevant. What she knew, sitting at her screen on the night of March 7th, was this: the most dangerous man left alive in Iran was somewhere in a city of 15 million people, and the clock that would eventually force him into the open had not yet started running. The question was, what would start it? March 13th, 2026. Every year on the last Friday of Ramadan, Iran holds Quds Day. Ayatollah Khomeini established it in 1979 as a public demonstration of revolutionary identity, a ritual affirmation that the Islamic Republic stood with the Palestinian cause, that the regime's founding ideology had not softened, had not compromised, had not become merely transactional. The Islamic Republic had held Quds Day every single year since 1979, through wars, through sanctions, through internal crises, without exception. In 2026, Iran was absorbing airstrikes. Its supreme leader was dead. Its military command structure was being systematically dismantled. Its cities were under blackout conditions several nights a week. Its population was living through the most acute military pressure the country had experienced since the Iran-Iraq War. The regime held Quds Day anyway. This is the part of the story that requires careful attention. Because what looks, from the outside, like ideological stubbornness or political theater, was, inside the regime's decision-making, something more calculated. Holding Quds Day was an act of institutional signaling. It was the regime saying to its own population and to the world, "We are still here. We have not broken. The machinery of the Islamic Republic is still running." And someone decided that the machinery needed a visible face. Ali Larijani appeared at the Quds Day proceedings on March 13th, not at the center podium, not in any official capacity that Iranian state television broadcast. He was present at the margins of a public gathering, visible, briefly, in footage captured on a private individual's camera and uploaded to a small social media channel within minutes of the event. He was on screen for 11 seconds. In Tel Aviv, Israeli SIGINT systems running continuous surveillance of all digital content originating from Tehran flagged the footage in under 40 minutes. Facial recognition confirmed the identification. Environmental analysis extracted location data from shadows, background architecture, and crowd density patterns. Shadow mapping confirmed the time of day against the footage timestamp. 11 seconds of a private individual's video, uploaded to a platform most people had never heard of, handed Israeli intelligence a 3-kilometer search zone in eastern Tehran. Inside the targeting cell, that footage was treated as the breakthrough the operation had been waiting for. The mood shifted. The surveillance net, which had been casting wide and catching nothing, suddenly had a corner of the map to focus on. Yael looked at the footage for a long time before she said anything. Then she said something that nobody in the room wanted to hear. He did that on purpose. Those 4 words landed in the targeting cell like a change of pressure. Not loud, not dramatic, just a shift in the air that made everyone at their screens stop and look at her. She walked them through it methodically. Larijani had spent 17 days as a ghost. He had built a disappearance protocol that had defeated a wartime Israeli intelligence operation for over 2 weeks. He had moved 11 times without leaving a traceable signature. He had managed to remain invisible inside a city under active surveillance in the middle of a shooting war. A man with that level of operational discipline does not accidentally appear on camera at a public event. He was there because someone in his inner circle advised him to be there. And the reasoning behind that advice, the logic that led to that recommendation was, Yael argued, the most dangerous thing in the room. Not the footage itself. The reasoning behind the appearance, the regime or the faction around, Larijani had concluded that public visibility was a form of protection, that Israel would not strike a senior political figure at a public religious observance, that the international optics of doing so would cost Israel more than the strike was worth, that the rules of the operation, as they understood them, created a window. They were operating on pre-war logic, on a version of Israeli targeting doctrine that had been accurate in 2018, in 2020, in 2022, on an understanding of what Israel would and would not do that had been rendered obsolete by Operation Epic Fury on the first day of the war. Larijani had been given bad intelligence about his own security situation, not by an enemy, by his own people. The room was quiet for a moment. Then one of the senior targeting officers asked the obvious question, "Does this change the operation?" Yael said it changed what the operation meant. It didn't change what the operation required. The search zone confirmation triggered a new phase of intelligence work in the 48 hours following Quds Day. The targeting cell was now operating with focus it had not had since the war began, a specific geography, a narrowed set of addresses, and a working theory about Larijani's behavioral pattern that Yael had updated in real time. The human intelligence network that Israeli intelligence had been building inside civilian populations in several Iranian cities became critical at this stage. These were not traditional agent networks, not trained operatives with tradecraft and handler relationships. They were distributed observation systems built from ordinary civilians with secure digital channels to report local activity. The model had been tested in Gaza and in southern Lebanon. It had been deployed at larger scale inside Iran over the preceding 2 months of the war. What came back from the eastern Tehran districts in the 24 hours after the search zone was established was fragmentary. No single report was actionable. But the pattern, when assembled, produced a signal. Multiple independent reports described unusual vehicle activity near a private residence in the Pardis suburb. a change in the pattern of arrivals, a darkened vehicle parked with the driver remaining inside, small details, the kind of details that mean nothing in isolation and everything in aggregate. The targeting cell had an address, and this is where the operation should have moved cleanly forward, but it did not, because the moment the address was confirmed, a different problem arrived. The address was a private family home, not a safe house in the intelligence community sense, not a rented property used by Larijani's security detail. A residence belonging to his daughter, a family home in a residential suburb that almost certainly contained people who were not Ali Larijani and were not combatants by any definition. The strike authorization process required confirmation, not just that the address was connected to Larijani, but that Larijani himself was present. Physical presence, not probable presence. Confirmed presence. The targeting cell began the confirmation process. Signals intelligence, thermal imaging, movement pattern analysis. Everything available was applied to the Pardis address over the next several hours. What came back was ambiguous. The thermal profile of the building was consistent with multiple occupants. Movement patterns around the entrance suggested arrivals in the preceding hours. But none of the signal's intelligence produced a direct confirmation that Larijani specifically was inside, as opposed to simply nearby or recently in the area. The window for the operation was not open indefinitely. Every hour of the confirmation process was an hour in which Larijani could move again. And if he moved, if he detected that the Pardis address had come under increased intelligence attention, the operation was over. He would go dark again, and this time he would not reappear. Inside the targeting cell, the conversation that nobody had wanted to have became unavoidable. Should the operation be paused pending better confirmation, or should the accumulated weight of the intelligence, the could-stay footage, the search zone, the human intelligence reports, the behavioral pattern, Yael's years-long file, be treated as sufficient to authorize? One officer argued for pause. The confirmation standard had not been met. Striking on incomplete intelligence was a risk to civilians, a risk to the operation's legitimacy, and a risk to the intelligence infrastructure if the strike missed and Larijani survived. Another officer argued the opposite. The confirmation standard, applied rigidly in this operational environment, was the thing most likely to cause the operation to fail entirely. They had everything except a direct signal. They were waiting for certainty in a situation that structurally could not produce certainty. The argument went back and forth for 2 hours. Yael said almost nothing during this period. She was working a separate thread, reviewing the behavioral file one more time, looking for the thing she might have missed, the detail that would resolve the ambiguity cleanly. She found something. Not a confirmation, a pattern. Larijani had arrived at the Pardis address at the same time of day, on 2 separate prior occasions captured in pre-war surveillance, when his daughter's family would have been gathered for an evening meal. He did not come when the house was quiet. He came when it was full, when there were enough people and enough noise and enough ordinary domestic activity that his arrival could disappear into the background. The timing of the current signals was consistent with that pattern. It was not confirmation, it was inference. The difference between the two is the difference between certainty and judgment. And in operations like this one, judgment is often the only currency available. She put the analysis on the table. She said clearly that it was inference, not confirmation. She said clearly that she believed the inference was reliable. She said that the decision was not hers to make. Then she waited. The room was quiet for a moment that felt much longer than it was. The abort option was still on the table. The window was still open. The aircraft were airborne, holding pattern, waiting for instruction. The question was no longer whether the intelligence was perfect. It hadn't been perfect at any point in this operation, and it was not going to become perfect in the time available. The question was whether it was enough. And no one in that room, on the night of March 16, 2026, could answer that with complete certainty, not even Yael. The authorization came through at 10:48 p.m. local time, not a clean green light, not a formal declaration, a conditional authorization, the kind that exists in the space between permission and instruction, where the operational team is told that the threshold has been met, but the final call on execution timing remains with the strike commander based on conditions on the ground. In practice, what this meant was go, but go carefully. The aircraft were already airborne. They had been airborne for hours, a standard operational profile for Israeli Air Force missions over Iran, designed so that no single surge of flight activity would distinguish a targeted assassination run from the dozens of other strike missions that had been running every night for the past 17 days. The jets would not leave their holding pattern until the final targeting confirmation was transmitted. They would not announce themselves. To anyone watching the skies over western Iran that night, nothing looked different. The first transmission went out to the strike package at 10:51 p.m. It was not a launch order, it was a movement order, a directional instruction that shifted the aircraft from their holding pattern toward the target corridor. In operational terms, this was the point of no easy return. Not impossible to abort, but significantly more complicated than a pause during the confirmation phase. Inside the targeting cell, the atmosphere had changed. The argument from the previous 2 hours had not been resolved so much as superseded. The authorization had come from above, the inference had been accepted as operationally sufficient, and the cell was now in execution mode. There was work to do. People returned to their screens. Yael was still working the behavioral file. She was looking at something that had surfaced in the last pass through the pre-war surveillance records, a detail about Larijani's security protocol when visiting family locations. On both previous recorded visits to the Pardis address, his protective detail had maintained a specific vehicle positioning pattern. One vehicle at the eastern approach to the street, one stationary near the residence itself, with the driver remaining inside. The human intelligence reports from the neighborhood had mentioned a darkened vehicle parked with a driver inside. One vehicle, not two. She flagged it internally. Not as an abort trigger, as an anomaly. A single vehicle, when the pattern called for two, suggested one of several possibilities. The security detail had been reduced, which could mean Larijani was not present, and the vehicle belonged to a family member. Or it could mean the detail had deliberately altered its positioning to reduce visibility. Or it could mean the pattern from the pre-war surveillance was simply not transferable to a wartime environment where every norm had been compressed and improvised. She noted the anomaly. She put it in the log. She did not raise it as a reason to pause, because she did not believe it was a reason to pause. She believed it was a data point that sat alongside other data points and that the weight of the full picture still held. But she noted it, because that is what the job is. You note the things that don't fit, even when you believe they don't change the conclusion, especially then. At 11:03 p.m., the strike package transmitted a status update, 2 minutes from target corridor entry. And then, at 11:04 p.m., the operation stopped. Not because of anything in the targeting cell, not because of a new intelligence report or a changed assessment. The operation stopped because the primary aircraft in the strike package experienced a targeting system fault, a technical flag that grounded the weapons, release protocol pending a diagnostic cycle. 11 seconds. That was the duration of the fault cycle. In practice, 11 seconds is nothing. In a mission with a narrow execution window over a target that could move at any moment, with aircraft that had been airborne for hours and were now inside hostile airspace, 11 seconds is an eternity. The strike commander called a hold, standard protocol. The fault had to be cleared before weapons release could proceed. The hold lasted 4 minutes and 17 seconds. Inside the targeting cell, those 4 minutes produced a specific kind of pressure that is difficult to describe to anyone who has not experienced it. It is not panic. It is not even fear, exactly. It is the awareness that time, in this environment, is not neutral. Every additional minute the aircraft spend inside Iranian airspace is a minute in which something can go wrong that has nothing to do with the target. Every additional minute the operation is live and not executed is a minute in which the situation on the ground can change in a way that cannot be corrected. One officer asked whether they should consider pulling the aircraft back and resetting for a second window the following night. The strike commander said nothing for a moment. Then he said the following night was not guaranteed. The target's location was confirmed for tonight. Tonight was the window. They would hold for the fault clearance and proceed. The fault cleared at 11:09 p.m. The hold was lifted. The aircraft resumed their approach. What happened in the next 14 minutes has been partially reconstructed from post-operation reporting, Israeli military statements, and analysis of the physical strike site. The complete targeting sequence has not been publicly disclosed. What is known is this. At approximately 11:17 p.m., a separate intelligence signal arrived at the targeting cell. Its source has never been officially confirmed. It has been described in various reports as a human intelligence communication that placed Larijani at the party's residence with a higher confidence level than anything previously received. What exactly this signal was, a direct asset inside the protective detail, a one-time source acting for personal reasons, a technical intercept that happened to produce a positive identification, is not known publicly. Israeli officials have declined to specify. What is known is that when this signal arrived, the anomaly Yael had flagged earlier, the single vehicle where the pattern called for two, was immediately recontextualized. The single vehicle suggested a reduced footprint, yes, but a reduced footprint was also consistent with Larijani's wartime behavior. He had been stripping his security detail down throughout the 17 days of the hunt. Less visibility, fewer people, travel that looked like family activity rather than protected movement. The single vehicle was not an absence of Larijani, it was evidence of how he had been operating. She updated the log. The inference column now had additional weight. The aircraft were inside the final corridor. At 11:23 p.m., the targeting cell received a passive thermal update from surveillance assets over the Pardis address. The thermal profile of the building had changed slightly from the readings taken 2 hours earlier. There were fewer heat signatures visible from the upper floor. Ground floor activity remained consistent. This was the moment that should have been a clean, unambiguous confirmation. And it was not, because thermal imaging of a residential building at night, interpreted in real time, is not an exact science. The change in the upper floor profile could mean occupants had moved downstairs. It could mean some occupants had left. It could mean the imaging angle had shifted. The strike commander reviewed the update. He made the assessment that the profile change was consistent with the family gathering that had moved to a common area, a dining room, a sitting room, later in the evening. He did not treat it as a disconfirming signal. He may have been right. He may have been rationalizing. In the moment, with the aircraft inside the final corridor and the window closing, the distinction between the two is impossible to maintain with any confidence. He kept the aircraft on approach. Then, for approximately 8 minutes, nothing happened. The aircraft completed their final targeting run. The targeting solution was locked. The weapons release protocol was active and holding, waiting for the final transmission. 8 minutes of silence in the targeting cell. Screens running. Data updating. Everyone doing their job without speaking. Yael was looking at the thermal profile again. She was working through a calculation she had not wanted to make, and was making anyway because the job required it. She was trying to estimate, from the heat signatures visible on screen, how many people were inside the building. Not to confirm Larijani, to understand the full picture of what the strike would find when it reached the residence. She counted 5 signatures, possibly 6. The imaging resolution was not precise enough to be definitive. She knew Larijani's son Morteza had been reported in the area that evening, not confirmed inside the residence, but in the vicinity. She knew his daughter and her family lived there. She knew that a protective detail, even a reduced one, would place at least 1 or 2 personnel inside the building rather than outside. The numbers were consistent with multiple scenarios. They were consistent with Larijani being present. They were also consistent with Larijani not being present and his family going about their evening without him. She kept the calculation to herself. Not because she was concealing it, because it did not change anything. The authorization had been given. The aircraft were on approach. The window was the window. What she was doing in those 8 minutes was something that experienced analysts do in the final moments of an operation they have worked for years. She was accounting, making sure that when it was over, whatever it produced, she had seen it clearly and recorded it honestly. She did. At 11:47 p.m., the weapons release transmission was sent. The strike hit the Pardis residence. The targeting cell confirmed impact. The secondary confirmation systems ran. The data began coming back, and in the first 90 seconds after impact, before any of the post-strike analysis was complete, before any confirmation from any source, before the Iranian state media had any idea what had just happened, the cell was already trying to determine one thing. Not whether the strike had been accurate. It had been accurate. Whether Larijani had actually been inside. Because the single vehicle anomaly was still in the log. The thermal ambiguity was still in the log. The inference had held. But an inference that holds is not the same as an inference that was correct. For the next 22 minutes, the answer was unknown. 22 minutes in which everything the operation had been built on was neither confirmed nor denied. 22 minutes in which the targeting cell had executed a mission against a private residence in a foreign capital, and did not yet know with certainty who they had killed. Yael did not move from her screen. She waited. The confirmation came at 12:09 a.m., not from Israeli intelligence assets, not from the surveillance system still running over the party's suburb. It came from a single communication intercepted from inside the Iranian security establishment, a message passing between two senior IRGC officers, neither of whom knew they were being monitored using a channel they believed was secure. The message was 4 words in Farsi. Yael read the translation on her screen. She did not react visibly. She made a note in the operational log, marked the time, and sent the confirmation upward through the authorization chain. Then she sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Not in relief, not in satisfaction. In the specific stillness that follows the end of something that took years and cost things that hadn't been fully counted yet. Israel's defense minister announced the kill publicly within hours. The statement named Larijani, alongside Khamenei and the base's commander, 3 eliminations framed as sequential steps in a single coherent campaign. The language was precise, controlled, and deliberately structured to project inevitability, to suggest that what had happened was planned, managed, and fully within expectations. Inside the targeting cell, the announcement landed differently. The 22 minutes of post-strike uncertainty, the window between weapons release and confirmation, had not been mentioned in the public statement. The single vehicle anomaly was not mentioned. The thermal ambiguity was not mentioned. The fault in the targeting system at 11:04 p.m., the 4-minute hold, the decision to proceed on inference rather than confirmation, none of it appeared in any public account of the operation. What the public received was a clean line from decision to outcome. What the targeting cell had lived through was something considerably less clean. This is not unusual. It is, in fact, the standard architecture of how covert operations are presented to the world. The uncertainty gets absorbed into the institution. The near aborts become internal lessons. The anomalies go into classified files. The public narrative is the operation as it succeeded, not as it was experienced. Yael understood this. She had understood it long before March 2026. It did not make it easier to sit with. The immediate fallout began before the confirmation was 20 minutes old. Inside what remained of Iran's security establishment, Larijani's death did not produce the paralysis that the operation's strategic logic had anticipated. It produced something faster and less controllable: acceleration. The IRGC commanders who had been in contact with Larijani during the 17 days of his disappearance, the men he had been quietly trying to align, to hold together, to position as a coherent response mechanism, received the news of his death and made a collective calculation within hours. The pragmatist was gone. The man who had been threading communication, channels to foreign governments, who had been maintaining the possibility of a negotiated pause, who had been arguing internally for managed de-escalation, he was gone. What remained was the hard core. The ideological layer of the IRGC that had never trusted Larijani's inclination toward calculation over conviction. The faction that had always believed the regime's survival depended not on negotiation, but on escalation, on making the cost of the campaign so high that the international coalition prosecuting it would fracture under its own political weight. Within 72 hours of the party's strike, Iran launched a retaliatory missile salvo against Israeli territory. The salvo was partially intercepted. Not entirely, the damage was real. This is where the earlier decision, the decision to increase surveillance on Larijani's daughter's residence rather than reduce it, the decision that Yael had argued against in the second week of March, begins to carry a weight it didn't appear to carry at the time. The argument Yael had made was not simply tactical, it was structural. She had argued that the pressure being applied to Larijani's network was visible enough to push him away from his family contact, but not visible enough to stop him from appearing at Quds Day. What she had not articulated fully at the time, but what the post-strike fallout made legible, was a deeper concern. The operation was designed to remove a destabilizing figure from the Iranian leadership equation. But Larijani was not, in the strategic sense, a destabilizing figure. He was a stabilizing one. He was the man most likely to prevent the regime's response to existential pressure from becoming purely reactive and unmanageable. Removing him did not weaken the Islamic Republic's capacity for violence. It weakened its capacity for restraint. The targeting cell had eliminated the correct target. The operation, as defined, had succeeded. What the operation's definition had not fully accounted for was that the correct target, in the tactical sense, was simultaneously the wrong target in the strategic sense. And the gap between those two framings, the gap between what the operation was designed to achieve and what the operation's success actually produced, was now visible in the skies over Israeli cities. The diplomatic track closed within 48 hours. Several European governments had been quietly maintaining back-channel frameworks in the weeks following Khamenei's death, not formal negotiations, but exploratory conversations about whether a ceasefire architecture was possible and who, on the Iranian side, could be a counterparty to such a framework. Larijani had been the name consistently identified by those governments as the one figure who combined the institutional authority and the relational history necessary to function as a genuine counterparty. With his death, those conversations stopped. Not because the European governments abandoned the effort, because there was no longer anyone on the Iranian side who could play the role. The vacuum Larijani's death created was filled within weeks, not by a pragmatist but by a council of IRGC hardliners whose position on negotiation was not ambiguous. They were not interested in a ceasefire framework. They were interested in survival through resistance, a posture that produced continued violence and no diplomatic exit. Yael filed her post-operation assessment 3 days after the strike. It ran to 47 pages. The portions that have been referenced in subsequent reporting, not publicly released but referenced, described the Larijani operation as tactically successful and strategically inconclusive. She wrote that the operation achieved its defined objective, and that its defined objective may have been incompletely specified. She did not describe the operation as a mistake. She did not recommend that it should not have been conducted. She documented what had been anticipated, what had not been anticipated, and what the gap between those two categories had produced. She noted the single vehicle anomaly. She noted the 22 minutes of post-strike uncertainty. She noted that the inference had proven correct. Larijani had been inside the residence, and that the process by which the inference had been reached contained elements that, in a different operational environment, or with a less experienced strike commander, could have produced a different outcome. She noted her original recommendation about reducing surveillance pressure on the daughter's residence. She noted that the recommendation had been rejected. She noted that the rejection had been reasonable given the operational constraints at the time. She did not editorialize, she documented. This is what the job requires when the operation is over and the questions begin to outlast the answers. What the death of Ali Larijani solved was precise and real. The Islamic Republic lost, in a single night, the last figure who understood how to manage the machinery of a revolutionary state under conditions of strategic retreat. The man who had survived 5 decades of Iranian politics by being indispensable to whoever held power was gone. The connective tissue that had been holding the fractured post-Khamenei leadership together was severed. What it broke was quieter and harder to name. It broke the possibility, however slim, of a managed outcome to a war that had no clean ending available to it. It removed the one person in the Iranian system who might have found the door that allowed the regime to step back from the edge without collapsing entirely. And it made something inevitable that was not, before the night of March 16th, inevitable. Not peace, not Iranian defeat, not any clear resolution. Just the next phase of a conflict that became, after that night, harder to stop and easier to continue. This is what precision operations produce when they work exactly as designed. Not endings. Continuations. New phases of the same problem, now missing the people who might have been capable of solving it. The aircraft returned to base before dawn. The targeting cell filed its reports and moved to the next file. Yael went home for the first time in 4 days, slept for 6 hours and returned to her desk. The next file was already open. If you follow the operations that don't make the front page the way the outcomes do, the decisions made in targeting cells, the anomalies that get absorbed into classified files, the strategies that succeed tactically and complicate strategically, this channel is where that work gets examined without the framing that official accounts prefer. Subscribe. Share this with someone who wants to understand what actually happened, not just what was announced. We will be here